Here's one thing I still want to say about the convention, though. It would be a mess, right? I mean, at this point, we're in the omnishambles. I've explained how it is that Democrats got us into the omnishambles, but it's obviously an omnishamble. So we're in the world of picking the least bad option. I still think, a convention that's a mess, that chooses a candidate that's not proven because they haven't had the time to run at the national level and make the pitch to voters and grow is a real problem. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, looked like a formidable Republican candidate for some good reasons. He had, from a conservative point of view, real policy achievements in Florida. Once he was at that national stage, it became obvious that that was all hype, that he simply wasn't up for it. That could happen to some of the people who are thinking of as possible replacements of Biden, like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, or Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. We simply don't know. They're not tested at that level. Second thing, Barack Obama, obviously a generational talent as a political candidate, right? Extremely effective campaign in 2008. In the early months of 2007, when he had already announced his campaign and he was this outsider shooting star senator who wasn't really expected to win, a lot of journalists who saw him speak said he's not quite there. He's not that charismatic, actually. He doesn't know that well how to make his pitch. But he spent months, speaking to rooms of 50 random people all across Iowa, honing those skills. And by the time he hit the big time and debated Hillary Clinton, in the key primary debates in the fall of 2007 and so on, he had grown tremendously as a candidate, and he was incredibly effective. We've deprived people like Gretchen Whitmer or like Gavin Newsom or Josh Shapiro, all the other kinds of people who might have run, of the opportunity to grow in that kind of way. And that's a problem as well. Now,
we've deprived them because we didn't run against Joe Biden and hold a proper Democratic primary, you mean?
Because Biden, the biggest journalist, didn't tell the public about what they knew on Biden's mental stage. And so we didn't end up putting pressure on him to not run. And so we didn't end up with a real primary season. And to be fair, they were too cowardly to run against Biden. They could have done so. But that would have been very hard, under those circumstances. But I want to say two things. One is, there's also upside here. Right? I think a fresh political phase when a lot of Americans are deeply fatigued, obviously with Joe Biden, but also with Donald Trump, is a real strength. I think there would be some excitement if by the end of August, we suddenly have a candidate who's plausible, who's 30 years younger than either of those candidates, who seems to represent a generational change. That person doesn't have to do all of that much to suddenly feel like a real breath of fresh air. And then, of course, there's advantages to only having 2.5 months of the opposition being able to define you, right? I mean, a lot of American politics is negative ads, is attack ads, is people trying to make people scared of you. Only giving the Republican Party 2.5 months to do all of that is a genuine advantage in an election. And as you're saying, there's other systems where you have candidates who come in 3 or 4 months before the election, who are obviously not completely unknown figures, but who rise to a new level of prominence, and they often fare quite well because voters say, hey, you know what, perhaps a fresh voice is what we need. Now, the other thing I want to say is, I think this is still a little bit in Democrats' hands. We have elections in France and the United Kingdom around now that were called in June, but we didn't know were happening on June 1st. And these countries were able to organize genuine national elections in that time span. I don't see why the Democratic Party, the moment that Joe Biden hopefully announces his intention not to run again, can't let's call it a one-day consultative popularity poll in 50 states, right? So you have one day in which you are asking any American who's interested to show up to the polls. It doesn't have to be an official vote, doesn't have to have any legal validity, right? And say, hey, you're going to have a bunch of candidates. Tell us who you like. And that, I think, would provide a lot of a democratic legitimacy to then coalesce around one of those candidates at the Democratic National Convention.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting proposal that you make in your piece as well. So some kind of a one-day consultative vote in all 50 states, a kind of a testing ground for the national appeal of various candidates. Who decides who gets on that ballot?
Well, the Democratic National Committee, but first of all, I don't see the point of keeping people off ballots. I mean, you don't want 7,000 weirdos who nobody has ever heard of, but I think you can have very minimal requirements. The standard one is that, there's got to be a couple of polls in which you poll at least 1%. But if there's 17 names on that ballot, I don't really care. That's perfectly fine. So have, minimum standards so that you don't have literal lunatics put their name on the ballot and, you have 274 names to choose from and it's such a mess that you can't find people at all. Say something like you got to have 1% in a few national polls so that it's just candidates who are in any way kind of plausible. If you end up with 10, 15 names, who cares? Let's see which of them actually appeal.
I mean, it is funny that the American political system works so slowly and the reactions to it are so fast. It's like it is, it's abiding by the logic of this social media algorithmic 24-hour news cycle hysteria where a single tweet can dominate news coverage for 3 hours and then disappear. And yet when you think about the prospect of putting a national vote to all Democratic voters, like it just like the idea of America being able to do that in 4 weeks, even though, as you say, other very big countries, it's not like, I think Americans sometimes think, oh, we've got so many people, how could we possibly do that? But like the European Union just voted, like everyone in Europe, which is larger, more populous than the United States, just went to the polls. India votes, it's 1 billion people. Like this does happen. And so there's no reason why you can't scale up the infrastructure in the United States to just go, yeah, okay, let's just have essentially a plebiscite. Don't even call it a primary or a vote, just some kind of an opinion poll, a nationwide opinion poll. It could even be a mail-in ballot if you wanted it to be, in which you've got a 10-day window to return your ballot if you're a registered Democrat and indicate who you want to be the party nominee. Now, the question would be, I guess, is that binding, or in your world would this be an indicative vote that would ultimately get decided at the convention by the delegates?
I think it would have to be an indicative vote because by the rules of a party, it is the Democratic National Convention that chooses the candidate, and there's a system for determining who's a delegate to that convention, and that system has at this point run. And of course it would open certain risks. What if you have one candidate who gets 39% of the vote and one candidate who gets 38% of the vote, and then perhaps the delegates don't feel bound to that outcome, and so they might end up preferring the candidate 38% of the vote, and that might alienate those who prefer the other candidate. Look, at this point we have no more risk-free options, right? The risk-free option would have been to actually have a genuine primary last fall. That would have been the best way out of this damn mess. But I think that this still is the best way forward to actually imbue the eventual Democratic nominee with some genuine democratic legitimacy. And with making people excited about this person, right? You would have a frantic period.
I mean, it's also the case, of course, people don't have to be that excited in the sense that I think that, I heard a pollster saying that this is the first election in American history where a generic candidate beats either of the actual candidates. In other words, if you ask people, would you rather a generic Democrat over Donald Trump, then the generic Democrat wins. Would you rather a generic Republican over Joe Biden? The generic Republican wins. So if you can just get a lump of cheese on a stick and call it the Democratic candidate, then as long as it isn't carrying a huge amount of baggage, it should be able to beat Donald Trump. It doesn't have to be a morning in America, once in a generation, Barack Obama talent.